welcome to today's webinar. So this is the Emissions Gap Report 2020 webinar, and it was co-organized by UNEP DTU Partnership, UN Environment Program, and the UNFCCC. So my name is Olivier. I'm a program associate at the UNEP DTU Partnership, and I will be today's webinar. I will be today's moderator for this webinar. So before we move to the main content of the webinar, let me just introduce you to this agenda. The agenda. So this webinar will be about 75 minutes long. It will begin with an introduction by Nikola Sagerberg, a coordinator of UNEP sub-program on climate change, for some welcome remarks. Then we'll have Anne Holoff, head of strategy, climate planning and policy at the UNEP DTU Partnership, who will set the frame of the report and speak to its key messages. And afterwards, that will be followed by the presentation of the key findings of the report. So we'll have some of the lead author of the Emissions Gap Report presenting some of the key findings of each of these chapters, and there will be a Q&A at the end of this session as well. And then afterwards, we'll move to a panel discussion with featuring some of the steering committee of the Emissions Gap Report, which will be discussing some of what are the prospects of getting back on track with the Paris Agreement temperature goal in light of the recent development, both in terms of the net zero emissions target and also in the past month, and in light of the Climate Ambition Summit over the weekend. And then we'll have Anne Holoff, who will close the webinar with some concluding remarks. And in case you want to get back to some of the presentation that will be presented in the report, in the webinar here, well, all the material will be posted on the UNEP DTU Partnership website and in the coming days, so we'll be able to access it there. And now I would like to introduce you to Nikola Sagerberg, who will present you some welcome remarks on behalf of UNEP. So please, Nicholas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Olivier, and welcome all speakers and panelists and participants on behalf of UNEP. The Emission Gap Report and the 11th version that we have now, or the 11th in a row ever since 2010, is one of the flagship reports for UNEP. It's a key kind of contribution to the negotiations and to help stakeholders to know where we are in the world. But also within UNEP, we use it for our program design. So it helps us design our midterm strategy, where we have just been in the process of designing it, and climate change continues obviously to be a big area, but it's also guiding us to where those policy solutions that we need to focus on. And it also guides our other reports. So later this week on Wednesday, we're coming out with the Global Status Report on buildings and construction, and it guides the focus areas of these more sectoral reports. And then finally, I would like to conclude with thanking all the authors and all the reviewers of this report, and obviously UNEP UNDP for managing this whole process of putting this report into fruition and getting. And I feel that the reports are just getting better every year. So thanks a lot for all your hard work to putting these reports in place. Olivier, back to you.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Nicholas, for this inspiring word and for this introduction to the Emissions Gap Report. And now I'll give the floor to Anne, who will present some of the key messages of this year's report. Please,
Thank
Anne.
you, Olivier, and welcome, everybody. So actually, I won't present a whole lot. I'm just going to say it's a really great pleasure for us to hold this webinar today. As Nicholas mentioned, this is the 11th UNEP Emissions Gap Report. And again, this year it's been put together and produced by an excellent team of leading experts from all around the world. This year, 51 authors have been involved in producing the report, and the process has been guided by a really outstanding steering committee. And today you will hear from these guys, or at least some of them. So again, this year, what the report is looking into is, first of all, where are global greenhouse gas emissions headed? What are the updates on the trends in global greenhouse gas emissions? What are countries doing in terms of achieving their Cancun pledges for 2020 and their NDC, the nationally determined contribution targets for 2030. Where will that get us in relation to where we need to be by 2030 to have a likely chance of limiting global warming by the end of the century to well below 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees? And then we turn this year, of course, because of the whole COVID situation, we look into some preliminary estimates and projections on what the implications of COVID and the related responses are on emissions after 2030. And then finally, as always, we dig into two areas that are extremely important and are achieving a lot of attention globally, both for reducing the emissions gap, and they've become even more interesting and relevant in the wake of COVID-19. So this year we look into the role of international emissions from shipping and aviation, and we look into the role of behavioral change and lifestyle changes in bridging the emissions gap. So without further ado, I think I will just hand it back to Olivier so we can get started on the presentations. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Anna, for this intro to the report and setting the stage for the lead author chapter presentations. And before I give the floor to them for this presentation of the key findings of the report, let me just tell you that there will be a Q&A at the end of the session. So please send us your question already in the chat box during this presentation, and please also state the author to which the question is intended to, and also please state your name and your institution. And now, without further ado, I will give the floor to Takeshi Kuramuchi, who will present the report's finding of Chapter 2. So please, Takeshi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Olivier. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Takeshi Kuramuchi from New Climate Institute. The Chapter 2 covers global emission trends and G20 members' progress towards their targets up to 2030. This chapter has benefited from contributions from all the experts listed here. So it was really a huge collective effort of experts around the world. So firstly, we'll start with the global emission trends. So in the last decade, the global greenhouse gas emissions have risen on average 1.4% per year. And in 2019, we saw a rapid increase of 2.6% increase of emissions compared to 2018 levels. When you look at emissions excluding the land use change emissions, then the emission increase was only 1.1%, but the increase in land use change emissions was much larger due to a large increase in forest fires, particularly in Asia and the Amazon. When you look at these historical trends up to 2019, there is a little sign of emissions peaking. However, in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic had an unprecedented impact on our global economy. Our report estimated that the CO2 emissions could decrease by 7% in 2020 compared to 2019 levels due to COVID-19 lockdowns and related restrictions. And the Global Carbon Budget 2020 launched last week also confirms this estimate. This reduction is significantly larger than what was observed during the 2007-2008 global financial crisis. This is only for CO2 emissions. The reduction rate for all greenhouse gas emissions will likely be somewhat smaller than the 7% because non-CO2 emissions are likely to be less affected. Now we move on to the G20 members' progress towards their targets up to 2030. G20 members account for nearly 80% of global GHG emissions. Our assessment, based on the review of the literature published in the last years, show that the G20 members are collectively not on track to achieve their nationally determined contribution emission levels. When you look at the individual members, we assess 16 member countries and regions. We show that 9 countries and regions are currently on track to meet their unconditional NDC targets with existing policies. This number of countries on track is 3 more than the last year. We have this year Argentina, Japan, and South Africa additionally in the list of countries on track to meet their NDC targets. There are many factors that contributed to this change in the rating for these three countries, including new policies adoption, implementation of existing policies, as well as revised GDP growth projections and revised national emission inventory data that were observed in these studies that we have reviewed. 5 countries will need additional policies or stricter enforcement of existing policies, and for 2 countries, it is uncertain whether they will meet their 2030 targets. While this assessment for 2030 is somewhat, not encouraging, there's also some exciting developments that were being observed in the past months. There's a growing number of countries that are committing to net zero emissions by 2050 or 2060. By now, 126 countries covering half of global GHG emissions have either formally adopted, announced, or currently considering to formulate the net zero emission goals. If the US joins forces with the Biden-Harris plan, then this share would increase by up to 63%. This is a very encouraging development, but this also means that there's a huge discrepancy between the long-term ambition and the inadequate level of ambition in the NDCs for 2030 and the current emission trends, both historical and also the projected emissions under current policies. To keep these long-term commitments feasible and credible, it is a must that net zero goals are urgently translated into stronger near-term policies in action and are reflected in the more stronger NDC targets.
Thank you very much, Takeshi. And now, Jory, the floor is yours. Perfect.
Yeah, thank you, Takeshi. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I have the pleasure to present this year's gap assessment of the report by the Chapter 3 author team. The gap, as every year, compares where we are heading with our global emissions to where we should be going to hold warming to 1.5 or well below 2 degrees. To estimate this, we assess a couple of scenarios, which you can see here on this figure. From top to bottom, you can see first in gray where global greenhouse gas emissions would be heading based on the policies that we had in 2010. Then in blue, that's where they would be heading if all currently adopted and implemented policies are realized, but no additional measures are undertaken. And then at the bottom, you can see where emissions should be going to be consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees. In addition, we have 2 scenarios that look at where emissions would be heading if all unconditional NDCs would be implemented, or if in addition also the conditional measures in the NDCs are implemented. From this visual comparison, you can already immediately see that at present, the current policies are not sufficient to achieve the conditional or unconditional NDC scenarios. That means that more policies are required if we want to achieve our NDCs. Now, if we compare the NDCs with the 1.5 and 2 degree scenarios, we can also estimate the emissions gap. And that is what you can see here. The emissions gap is still very large and virtually unchanged from last year. For limiting warming to 2 degrees, it is about 12 to 15 billion tons of CO2 equivalent emissions, gigatons of CO2 equivalents, as we refer to them. And for 1.5, the gap is closer to 30 billion tons. The COVID pandemic hasn't changed our gap assessment much, but more to that later. A lot of work does still remains to be done. Bridging the emission gap requires that countries increase their NDC ambitions threefold to limit warming to 2 degrees and more than fivefold to be on track to achieve a 1.5 degree goal. Increasing the ambitions of emission reductions by 2030 is extremely urgent, and this can really not be emphasized enough. There are also important implications of not being on a clear downward trajectory by 2030, and that is illustrated in this figure here. First of all, insufficient action over the next decade will lock in carbon-intensive infrastructure, and this increases the transition risk to the global economy because more fossil fuel infrastructure will have to be shut down before the end of its economic lifetime. A delay in emission reductions also increases our reliance on CO2 on CO2 removal, and at present these measures are still uncertain and very risky. Most importantly, however, a delay in action until 2030 will commit us to global warming and expose us to higher climate risks. And we will also not be able to reap the benefits, such as improved air quality, of achieving climate change mitigation and sustainable development together. Now, at present, the NDCs do not hold warming to the Paris Agreement temperature limits. Instead, they merely keep global warming to 3 degrees over the course of this century. As Takeshi already highlighted, recently there have been a lot of net zero goals that have been announced. In this year's report, we carried out a preliminary assessment of what they would bring, and we found that altogether, if implemented, they would reduce our global warming by around ½ degree. So that means that these net zero goals clearly help, but they really need to be backed up by emissions reductions by 2030, because otherwise it is not credible that they will actually be achieved by mid-century or for whenever these long-term net zero goals are set. Finally, as highlighted earlier, the COVID pandemic hasn't changed much to our gap assessment. However, how we respond and recover from the pandemic will really determine whether we are putting the world on track to meet the Paris Agreement or whether we will have closed the door on it. In this plot, in the middle, we show how, everything else remaining equal, emissions in 2030 will be slightly lower because of the COVID pandemic. You can also see that it clearly depends on how quickly a safe cure can be rolled out. On the right-hand side, however, we show that if economic stimulus is used to roll back climate policies, emissions could also well be higher. The most important bar here, however, is at the very right-hand side, and that shows that a green recovery, that is a recovery where economic stimulus measures are aligned with long-term climate goals, can already bring emissions down in line with limiting warming to 2 degrees. And further climate leadership can then help to even bring it in line with 1.5. Bottom line is just that we are not on track, but recent developments of net zero targets and NDCs are encouraging. However, they will have to be corroborated over the next years. And with that, I would like to hand over to the next speaker.
Great. Yeah, so also welcome everybody from my side. I will quickly present in the name of the author team of Chapter 4 exactly on what we can say already, how these fiscal responses, recovery and rescue measures can help or not to bridge that gap that Yuri just outlined, that we identified once more in this year's gap report. So when we look at the fiscal spending that has been taken place throughout 2020 in direct response to the pandemic, we see that this is really happening at unprecedented scale. Just till September 2020, the IMF estimated that this was around the globe around 12 trillion US dollars. And of course, many of the G20 countries really being at the forefront in terms of fiscal spending. These have been, for instance, additional revenues, the additional spending on certain programs. It is foregone revenue, but then also loans or guarantees to support corporations and companies in the respective country context. So of course, the question is, how has that fiscal money been used to support or not support a low carbon transition in line with the Paris Agreement? And what we have found, and you see the summary picture, it's a bit hard to read here on that slide, but of course you can then also look into it in the report. And what we have found across the G20 member countries, when looking at different trackers from the IMF, from Vivid Economics, from the Oxford Economic Recovery Project, or the Climate Action Tracker, we have found that across the G20 member countries to date, this opening to really use these scarce fiscal resources to really accelerate and foster a low carbon transition has not been kind of taken up, or even on the contrary, it has been largely missed. And this is mainly because many countries, and you see that, for instance, here also on the left-hand side, this kind of red-colored high carbon efforts category, many countries' measures and packages so far have supporting a high carbon status quo, and some of them then even in addition foster new high carbon investments. And there's only a few countries, roughly 25% of all G20 member countries, that really dedicate larger shares into a more kind of low carbon transition of the recovery funds. Overall, one has to say it's not too late to, of course, seize further opportunities in regards to low carbon transition. However, one has to say, and this also shows basically what Yuri just presented a minute ago, is that if we don't do that, or if the governments don't do it, the Paris Agreement goals and also the midterm targets, the NDC targets that have been partially revised also over the last weeks and hopefully then the next months, that these will slip further out of reach. When we look into some of the countries that can be considered international frontrunners in terms of dedicating larger shares of their packages to low carbon measures, we see that there are some European countries like France and Germany, or also the Republic of South Korea, that dedicate up to 3% of their GDP to these low carbon measures and actions. However, even with these countries, and again, we can see that here on the left-hand side, even these countries have further room and scope to address what they've been missing so far in also promoting measures that have a high carbon impact. So also for those countries, it is still important to stay on track in the next stages of fiscal interventions. So what can we say when looking forward? And then that was something that we assessed in the last part of that chapter. So we looked at the multiple dimensions that guide fiscal spending. So these dimensions that governments and policymakers look at when setting up their fiscal rescue and recovery spending. And then, of course, these are of economic nature, like the timeliness or employment impacts of certain measures, but then, of course, also the climate impacts or wider socioeconomic impacts. And what we've done is across 6 sectors is to identify real-world case examples on low carbon and high carbon measures. So as you can see here, for instance, on the right-hand side for land use and environmental protections, examples like done in India or the Republic of Korea, Ethiopia, Pakistan, where such measures were an integral part of their rescue and recovery plans. Perhaps important to say as a disclaimer is that all of these measures, when being replicated, of course, to other countries, policymakers would need to look at into real detail how that can be done, also because those examples here in the report were selected on the category of how low carbon and high carbon from a climate perspective they are, but not necessarily covering all the other dimensions. And of course, it's very important to consider that. To sum it up, this is really then something that we also identify in the report, that for the next stages of fiscal interventions, G20 countries as well as others really can look at such examples to then kind of build up on that in the next stages of fiscal interventions and regulatory changes to ensure that those funds being invested now and going into 2021 are really used to accelerate that transition that we so desperately need when looking at the findings of Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. And with that, I would like to hand over to David on the presentation of Chapter 5.
Thank you, Frederic, and good day to everybody. This chapter is one of the themed chapters for this year's Emissions Gap Report. And I think this is the first time we've revisited in a comprehensive manner international shipping and aviation. So I'll be giving this presentation on behalf of my co-lead Jasper Faber and our contributing authors who contributed to this chapter. So the role of international aviation and shipping. These emissions are not identified within the Paris Agreement, as I'm sure you know, but they continue to be addressed by the relevant UN specialised agencies, the International Maritime Organization and the International Civil Aviation Organization. In terms of the magnitude of their emissions, their gross sectoral emissions of CO2 in 2018 were around about 2 gigatons equally split, so around about 1 gigaton each. The peculiar aspect of these sectors, of course, is that a large proportion of them are international emissions, hence not mentioned in the Paris Agreement. And they are 71% in shipping and at present 65% in aviation. Because of the nature of these industries, largely international, there are many synergies in the mitigation measures that you might consider. So you don't really tend to consider mitigation from the domestic point of view and the international point of view. It really doesn't make that much of a difference. So the long-term nature of these sectors means that the development and their fleet rollover is quite tied in. There is a significant technological lock-in because it takes a while, for example, to develop an aircraft, and an aircraft is in the fleet as a ship is in the global fleet for very many years before they are retired. And at the moment, both sectors have a very large dependency on liquid fossil fuels as they're really their only alternative right now. So what do these emissions look like? Well, on the left, we can look at a combined chart of shipping emissions where you get both the transport work in terms of projected ton miles, and that's the top swathe of the chart, which is indicated by the dashed line and the brown dotted line. And they're indexed to the 2008 base year of this work of the IMO, which is underneath it. And this was, of course, work pre-COVID pandemic that was undertaken. So you can see quite a large projected growth in terms of transport work, and how this translates into CO2 emissions. You can see in the kind of triangle on the lower side of this, and accordingly you can see there is a slight reduction over time on the projected carbon intensity. So that's the CO2 per unit transport work. So those represent the kind of high and low ranges of CO2 projections at the moment. On the right-hand side, this is a particular chart that comes from the International Civil Aviation Organization. And these are international emissions only, though the projected growth of domestic emissions would look very similar, but there will be more. That would make the total larger, of course. And what you can see from the top line, what the top line shows is a kind of baseline level where you just replace the fleet as planned. And then we have a range of technology scenarios, which is the purple band, and that potentially can reduce the emissions a little bit further, as indicated by the pale white arrow. Then you have another band, which is the operational improvements that might come about. These are finite, of course, and they tend to be smaller. So that gives you an increasing emission trajectory over time, under the assumption that the whole sector is powered by liquid fossil fuels. And just for reference is the kind of 2020 emissions level as was projected at the time of this work. So what about these emissions in the future? What might they look like? Well, if you add those two together, just the international emissions alone, and if you compare them to the 4 illustrative model pathways of the IPCC, in their special report on 1.5 degrees and global warming. What you can see on the left with the coloured bands is a kind of range of emissions from the two international sectors added together. And they're around about 5% of total emissions in 2015 to 2020, something like that. But if emissions start to come down as is required for net zero type trajectories, these illustrative model pathways cross the zero line at years somewhere between around 2050 and 2060, something like that. But at the point in time at 2050, if these two sectors do not have further mitigation or policy measures applied to them, they would represent about 60 to 220% of the potentially allowable emissions, allowable in the sense of to keep to a 1.5 degree trajectory in that year. So you can see that there is a bit of a problem here. So in conclusion, additional policies are required to bridge the gap between current trajectories of shipping and aviation and pathways consistent with the Paris Agreement. And both sectors will need to maximise their energy efficiency whilst transitioning away from fossil fuels. This is the key, really. Certainly for the aviation sector, the biofuels and synthetic kerosenes from biomass or CO2 and hydrogen are probably the most realistic fuel alternatives for aviation, and to an equal degree to shipping, but shipping has more options. So this is for the short to medium term, but these will compete with other uses in terms of biofuel. For the longer term fuel alternatives, you may get renewable electricity at sufficient volumes to generate CO2-free hydrogen, and then you could use hydrogen as a fuel for different configurations of aircraft and ship designs. So all in all, changes in technology, operations and fuel use and demand all need to be driven by new policies, and the cost of fuel is likely to increase several fold according to much of the literature. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. I'm Susie. I'm a researcher from Climate Outreach, and I'm very pleased to be presenting Chapter 6, which explores the role of lifestyle change in bridging the emissions gap. I'm presenting on behalf of co-lead authors Stuart Capstick, Radhika Khosla, and also our contributing author team. So lifestyle changes are a necessary component to meeting global emissions reduction targets. Approximately 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions are connected to households when we use consumption-based accounting. And in our chapter, the main sectors that we looked at were mobility, residential, and food sectors, with each accounting for around 20% of lifestyle emissions. In each of these sectors, we describe how there are different ways to enable emissions reduction using an emerging framework called Avoid, Shift, and Improve. And we drew on a meta-review by Ivanova and Wood to look at the impact of certain lifestyle changes on potential reductions in annual personal emissions on average. So for instance, emissions reductions could be the result of avoidance of certain activities shown in the light purple in this figure. For instance, avoiding one long-haul return flight per year. It could also involve, for instance, shifting towards low-carbon alternatives, such as increasing active travel or moving to a vegetarian diet, and this is shown across the sectors in a darker purple. And there may also be opportunities to improve the efficiency of activities or services, such as improving the efficiency of vehicles or renewable energy or low carbon fuel use, and that's shown in orange. And overall, the mobility sector has the largest potential to reduce emissions in an equitable way. That's because there's a strong link between income and mobility emissions. And so much of the consumption emissions in the mobility sector come from luxury consumption, whereas in comparison, for instance, the food sector consists of more basic consumption. And these considerations are vital because there's enormous inequality in emissions based on income, as shown by Oxfam Stockholm and the Stockholm Environment Institute analyses published this year, which shows that not all individuals have similar footprints or an equal capacity to act. But in fact, the richest 1%, which is around 80 million people, you can see here, consume together more than twice as much in this red bar as the poorest 50%. which number around 3.9 billion people. And the richest live in all continents. Around half of consumption emissions from the top 1% and the top 10% come from high-income countries and half from middle-income countries. And that means that on a per capita basis, you can see on the leftmost graph, in order to meet targets for 1.5 degrees, the global richest 1% need to reduce their footprint by a factor of 30. Whereas at the same time, the poorest 50% could increase their emissions by a factor of 3 and still remain under the target for average per capita consumption emissions. So in order to bring about lifestyle change, we need both individual change and system change. They are interrelated and two sides of the same coin. For instance, some citizens, as I've described, can reduce personal emissions, acting on a personal and immediate level. And at a social level, a societal level, they can act as citizens, as members of communities, exerting social influence on others. And we've seen many examples of, for instance, the spread of household solar or electric vehicles, and also that citizen participation in protests and assemblies can bring about wider structural change. But at the same time, there's a need for major changes to the structural and physical environments in which these lifestyles take place. So, for instance, whether the cultural and social norms that shape our habits and routines are conducive to low-carbon lifestyles, whether there's infrastructure in place, whether supply chains function to make low-carbon food options available and other options. And as many of the authors have already presented, particularly opportunities for green recovery measures that are already discussed. And finally, a stable climate is compatible with greater equity, including well-being and a better quality of life, but it will require changing energy-intensive lifestyles as well. Thank you very much for your attention. I will now pass to Anne, who will be running the Q&A.
Thank you very much, both to you, Susie, and to all the other presenters. If you don't mind, I would actually ask you to switch on your cameras, and we have received a few questions. And it's not because I'm not interested that I'll be looking in the wrong direction. It's because I can only see the questions on the screen over here. So first of all, there were a few questions asked about whether this recording from this webinar would be made available, and it will be made available shortly. You can access this from the UNEP DTU partnership website. Then we have some more substantial questions, and let's start with one here. This is for all the speakers. The decrease in emissions during the pandemic has had little or no impact on the ongoing growth in global atmospheric CO2. This suggests that decreasing emissions in the future may not have the desired effect in limiting warming. Any thoughts on this? It seems to me that too much effort is being put on trying to reduce emissions and not enough effort is being put on addressing the issues that will arise from climate change. That's already locked into the system. So you can ponder on that while I read another one, and that's probably for Yuri, the next one. It's on the IEA sustainable bar on your slide. Why and based on which findings are we confident that this is in line with 2 degrees? And please state the probability for this projection. And please also refer to a 97.5 probability of staying well below 2-degree path and what that would mean for 2030 and the yearly milestones up to 2030. Easy question, right, Yuri? And we can take one more, and that I presume is actually also for Yuri. The report states that the global greenhouse gas emissions, including land use change in 2019, were 59 gigatons of CO2 equivalent, but the table for the emission gap states 59 gigatons of CO2 equivalent for current policies in 2030. So, which is correct? Why is there a difference between what we have in the report in Chapter 2 and in Chapter 3 in terms of these numbers? And then let's just go to David. There are a few questions for you. How on earth shall we reach global net zero if for one transport sector alone we will emit 650 million ton forever? And then also, in addition, how does the ICAO come to 650 million ton per year? As you have said, aviation emits 2 gigatons per year. I think we should start with these questions. And anybody who would like to go first? Yuri, please.
Yeah, so I think there are 3 questions I can respond to. I'll just take them as they were posed. The first is on CO2 concentrations. What Takeshi presented as the assessment of Chapter 2 was that the emissions, or the amount of carbon dioxide that in this particular year we have put into the atmosphere, has been reduced by around 7%. That means that we are still emitting, we are putting a lot of emissions or carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And as long as we are doing that in such quantities that are larger than the natural sinks, concentrations will be going up. So this really shows that if we want to either stabilize or even decline concentrations, emissions really need to go down for a much longer and much more sustained, in a much more sustained way. So I think it is really important to understand that the COVID pandemic and the small reduction of it is really no structural solution to what we need to do to tackle climate change. On the second question, whether the IEA would be consistent with 2 degrees, well, the only reason why we say that it is consistent with limiting warming to 2 degrees is because it ends up with an emission level in 2030 that is consistent with our 2-degree pathways. The probability of staying below 2 degrees in that case would be 66%. If you want to have a much higher probability, you just need to go to lower emissions. And as an example, if you would be following the 1.5 degree pathway that we have in our report, that is the pathway that has even 15 gigatons of lower emissions in 2030, you would end up with roughly, let's say, very roughly 80 to 90% of actually limiting warming to 2 degrees. So there is, of course, a spread in these estimates. And then I've been talking for a long time, but if you allow me, I'll also answer the 59 gigaton CO2 questions, current and future. Okay. The main difference between those two estimates is the method that is used to assess the land use and land use change emissions. We basically use information from 2 different literatures that where the emissions estimates are not precisely harmonized. So what is important is to compare the relative difference between 2020 levels and 2030. The 2 estimates do have overlapping uncertainty ranges, but we did not just harmonize them to have the exact same value in 2020.
Thank you, Yuri. David, maybe you want to go on the shipping and aviation questions?
Sure, yes. One is very easy to untangle, which is the numbers. So the 2 sectors together are about 2 gigatons, and they're about equally split. That's emissions in around 2018, thereabouts. So it's 1 gigaton for each sector. So the graph that I showed for the ICAO projections were international only, because ICAO focuses on international emissions because that's its mandate. It doesn't have a mandate for domestic emissions. So, 65% of 1 gigaton, given the different data methodologies, you end up at around 600 megatons of CO2, 640, whatever was on the axis there. So the numbers are quite easy to untangle if you just consider that that's the international only. The other question is the $1 million question is, how on earth are we going to fix this, basically? And that's a nice question. I think what that graph shows is that if we do nothing and technology just continues to improve as you might expect it to, we're going to end up in trouble for both sectors. Also, as I tried to highlight, we have a long technological lead-in time and then a relatively slow fleet turnover time. So this actually is an indicator of the urgency with which we need to address these sectors. Now, the good news part of this is that essentially we have drop-in type fuels that will work for these sectors in terms of synthetic fuels and biofuels, neither of which are produced at sufficient scale. But they're not produced at sufficient scale, and certainly the synthetic fuels are not produced at an industrial level because there is no policy drive to make that happen. If I can put it very crudely, as long as it's cheaper to dig oil out of the ground, it will still continue to happen. So you have to have something in place that will change those circumstances, and that will change them. In the longer term, you do have alternative fuels for shipping, like ammonia, perhaps. It's quite difficult to handle, and that's maybe a tricky issue. Longer term for aviation, you may also be able to run liquid hydrogen powering these aircraft as well, if you can generate the hydrogen from renewable sources, which is a zero CO2. So there are solutions, but nothing is driving them at the moment. So that graph, if you like, is a nice illustration of the collision course that we're on, unless we start to think about replacing these things now. And we do need the policies in place to make that happen.
Thank you very much, David. Before we move to the panel discussion, there were quite a few more questions. I just wanted to give Susie the chance to respond to a few of them. So there's one here. Based on your presentation, it's clear that enabling social transformation is key to achieve the climate targets. Based on your experience at Climate Outreach, can you say which approaches you consider the most effective to achieve this transformation? And how do you see the role of research in enabling this transformation? And there was another one related also to your chapter, basically asking how is this inequality going to affect women? I don't know if you have any views on that. Please, Susie.
Thank you, Anne. Those are both very big questions, very good questions. I think there is, as the other authors have sort of alluded to, there's really not just one thing that we need to do, right? This is a problem that we need to try and throw everything at in order to solve. And in terms of driving social change, a lot of the work that I've been doing personally but also my co-authors has been about speaking to people's values and creating a social mandate for change. So really building that social drive, because as we've started to see around the world, citizen action can lead to system and structural change as well. And for the second question, I know that there have already been a lot of studies already been conducted this year, particularly on COVID and the effects of COVID-19 on women, but also in the intersections of disadvantage for women and climate change, and that's an ongoing problem as well.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to all of you for these excellent presentations. Now I'll hand over to Surabhi Menon from Climate Works Foundation to get us to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you to the presenters who did an excellent presentation of all the chapters. Well done and well on time. So in this panel, we're going to have we'll have 4 panelists from the UN Steering Committee Gap Report itself. So the last month or two, we have seen many new announcements that have been coming with new targets. And more importantly as well, the US will re-enter the Paris Agreement with the Biden administration in January. Despite COVID, we've also seen some rallying around the 5-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement over the weekend at the Climate Ambition Summit. However, as you saw in the presentations earlier, the implementation part still remains a challenge. Sorry, my dog is getting a little excited. The implementation part is still a big challenge. So in this panel, we're going to address some of the prospects for how we could try to get back on track with the Paris Agreement temperature goals for the next 5 years, because we have to make that transition very rapidly. So we have 4 panelists, and I'm going to pose a question to each of them, and then if there's time, we'll have a Q&A. I'm going to start with Bert Metz, Bert, for years you have been making, and rightly making, the argument that the full benefits of emission reductions in terms of associated benefits such as jobs, GDP, etc., all have to be quantified so that the benefits outweigh the cost, and then implementation, we think, could be straightforward. Now, with the rescue and recovery packages coming in as a result of COVID, this is the right time to make the case for green investments. But as we saw in Frederick's presentation, it's not quite there. So what do you see as lacking to make that case to avoid missed opportunities? And I would say this is a $1 trillion question because of the size of these stimulus packages.
Thank you, Sarabi. Well, considering climate change mitigation, I think should always be, not irrespective of crisis or no crisis, always be seen in the context of development and economic and social progress. A stable and healthy climate is just a precondition for improving human well-being. Without that, and poverty eradication is a good example, without a good, healthy climate, we can't do that. It's simply impossible. So the two things go hand in hand anyway. And now with the COVID crisis, actually a unique opportunity arises, because indeed, as you say, there's trillions being put aside by governments now to invest in things to help overcome the economic consequences. And 12 trillion, according to the IMF recently, or alone, I mean, much more in developed countries, unfortunately, than in developing countries. But this is a huge amount. And of course, it matters a lot how that money is going to be spent. The two dimensions, of course, there's rescue, immediate intervention to keep much of the economy going, people not immediately losing their jobs, etc. And there is a component that gradually will become more important, that is recovery, that is real investment to create new jobs that get lost in the old economy because of the crisis. So we have to use this. This is a unique opportunity, and it has to be used. Now, in the rescue phase, you are somewhat limited. But what some governments have shown to do is attach conditions to the immediate rescue money that they put on the table in the forms of guarantees or loan subsidies, etc. You can, especially the bigger companies, you can ask them to commit to a longer-term sustainable strategy and to specific measures they can take. In the recovery phase, it's clear there are quite a few areas where you can see immediate benefits in terms of jobs, in terms of economic stimulus. Take the transition to renewable energy. Per unit of energy, solar and wind create a lot more jobs than fossil fuel installations. There is an enormous investment required in the grid, because of these variable renewables, you need a much more robust grid. Housing area is an enormous need for insulating houses to make them more energy efficient, to create heat pumps, all sorts of things to renovate the building and make it independent of fossil fuel. In the mobility sector, the electric charging infrastructure is underdeveloped. There's a huge need to invest in that to make it possible for a rapid penetration of electric vehicles. There's nature-based solutions. We have to really do massive reforestation. We have to restore degraded lands. So industry has to become low carbon, and there's a huge need for investing in innovation, in hydrogen, green hydrogen, in low carbon steel, etc. So, I mean, it's up for grabs, I would say, but governments have to take the right decision to spend the money in the right manner.
Great. Thank you, Bert. Those were a nice list of areas that we could hope to see some kind of progress, especially if there are good jobs and other GDP multipliers associated with it. Just a quick follow-up question. Do you see enough information out there to help governments make those decisions, or do you still see some good evidence-based analysis being needed?
Well, I mean, the reality is that governments are not only influenced by good information, they're influenced by political lobbies, incumbent industries, often well organized and influencing the political decisions. So it's more reminding governments that information is really available, and mobilizing civil society to make that point. I don't think it's a matter of lacking information. Great.
Thank you, Bert. And that's a good segue to our next panelist, Katya Simonova from the UNFCCC. Katya, as we saw, there's been a growing number of low emission strategies with net zero emission goals from major emitters that have been put in place. Takeshi presented some of that. So what would you like to see, sitting where you are at the UNFCCC, coming out of these goals in the next 5 to 10 years in order for us to be confident that those long-term goals are going to be met?
Thank you very much, Surabhi, for this interesting question on a topic that I really appreciate a lot. These are long-term strategies and a commitment to net zero goals. As Takeshi pointed out, at the time of the completion of the UNEP Gap Report, we had already 126 countries that cover 51% of the global emissions that have net zero goals that are formally adopted, announced, or under consideration. If we add the US to this group eventually next year, this number will grow to 63% of the emissions and around 70% of global economy. But things change as we speak. And just over the weekend, following the Climate Ambition Summit, we have seen 24 countries that announced new commitment strategies or plans to reach net zero or carbon neutrality. And the recent commitments for carbon neutrality from China, Japan, South Korea, the EU, and again, importantly, during the summit by Argentina, have established a very clear benchmark for other G20 countries, because your point was about the major economies. And this is in addition to France and the UK that have already a net zero enshrined in law, and Canada, South Africa, and Mexico, where considerations of the net zero goals are at advanced stage. And importantly, there are a number of countries that at the summit set out even more ambitious goals and going even further. Finland to achieve net zero 2035, Austria 2040, Sweden 2045. And this is why, very rightly, on my view, the UNEP Gap Report concludes that the most significant and encouraging development in terms of climate policy in 2020 is the growing number of countries that have committed to achieving net zero emission goals by mid-century. But again, looking again at your question, whether these ambitious long-term goals are sufficient, my response would be that this kind of commitments to carbon neutrality in longer term does not necessarily automatically translate into climate ambition. And I think that the report very rightly captured this point by pointing out to two discrepancies. The first discrepancy is discrepancy between the net zero goals for the countries that establish for themselves such goals and current indices. And the second discrepancy that was also kind of highlighted in the presentation by Yuri is the discrepancy between emission levels that are consistent with NDCs and those that the current policies can deliver. And this is why, again, I'm coming back to the report that acknowledges that the litmus tests, whether these announcements for net zero in the mid-century will work or not, will be the extent to which these goals will be reflected or translated in near-term policy action. That in practice would mean significantly more ambitious NDCs, at least for this decade up to 2030. And it will be also, in my view, critical to have much more countries to commit to carbon neutrality compared to what we have now, or net zero by the mid of the century, and enshrine these commitments in the long-term low emission development strategies that are consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Submission of these strategies, according to the Paris Agreement, is voluntary. It should be made this year, and I'm extremely encouraged to see this growing number of countries making such submissions, which is extremely important in terms of provide the destination of travel for each country, within which they can nest their much shorter term steps to address climate change in the form of NDCs. Back to you, Surabhi.
Thank you very much, Katja. That's great to see all of the positive commitments that have just come in from over the weekend as well. So Simon, the UK has also just made a very bold and ambitious NDC target in the last week. And the hope is for the UK that these targets could be met without offsets. This year's GAP report had a chapter on sustainable lifestyles that Susie presented, and she also outlined some of the tactics to make it work. I'd like to ask you how you see behavior traits that have been learned during COVID, consumption-related emissions that Susie spoke about, as well as trade. How would these affect how the UK or any major importer country use these tactics to help meet some of the ambitious targets they have put forward?
Thanks, Surabhi. Well, let me say first, it's really wonderful to be associated with this really excellent report and have no responsibility at all for its content, but to be able to congratulate Anne and all the authors, and I think you've done a great job. I don't speak for the UK, let me say that. What's my key takeaway from the report? And it picks up on something Katja said. 2050 emissions targets are great, and zero emission targets for mid-century are consistent with Paris, more or less. But unless you do something very concrete about 2030, you don't get to the right answer in 2050 because of all the lock-in issues that were discussed. Now, the UK commitment to a 68% reduction over 1990 levels of emissions by 2030 is consistent with a pathway that takes us to net zero. And I have to say, not many countries have done that, and not many with as much detail as provided by our independent committee on climate change. So we're going in the right direction. But as 2020 has shown us with all the COVID crisis, moving to a different trajectory is not something that you can take lightly. We've seen how much disruption to national economies has taken place in 2020. And although we've managed to cut emissions by 7%, we have to do that every single year. And there will inevitably be many losers as well as many winners as we move to that trajectory. And it's important for that reason that the UK carbon budget published last week, the 6th carbon budget, talks a lot about a just transition and about the need for governments to invest in the kind of measures that Bert was talking about, but to do it in a way that projects jobs. Now, where does lifestyles fit into this? Everybody agrees behavior has to change, but as the chapter in our report makes clear, you can't just tell people to change unless you provide the enabling environment for them to do it. No point in saying to people, don't fly, travel by train if there isn't a train. You have to have the infrastructure in place. But once you begin to have the infrastructure in place, then you absolutely have to have people's participation through cultural norms, through political pressure, through campaigning to make sure that the changes happen. Now, I take the view, and I'm not sure whether this is absolutely in line with the report, that you can give people basic messages about eat less meat or have a meatless couple of days in the week, fly less and so on. I think it's really hard to do that without better information, which is why I encourage everybody to work out your own carbon budget and see where your critical points are for reducing your own emissions. And that enables you to make the case in your household, in your own life, and more widely in society. So information is absolutely key to making these changes. Now, one final thing then is that when you look at the objectives countries are setting, the mid-century, the 2030, the NDCs, they're all based on territorial emissions. But when I look at my own consumption and I look at everybody else's consumption, you find that an awful lot of that is imported and doesn't feature in the territorial emission calculations. So globally, about 40% of all greenhouse gases are traded. In the UK, it's higher than that. And because we are managing to cut territorial emissions, imported emissions are growing. So as we think about what consumers do and where they interact with world policy, we have to look also at imported emissions, which are, I think it's a pity, missing from the UN Environment, UNFCCC negotiation framework. So what does the Committee on Climate Change, what does the Sixth Carbon Budget say about that? Well, they rest a lot of hope in the fact that if everybody moves to net zero and everybody has adequate NDCs, then that problem kind of solves itself. But I think something else will happen, because if you look at the policy world where I live and not the climate modeling world, all the discussion is about border taxes, about imposing tariffs on high carbon imports. And of course, that's really important for those of us who work on development, because there will be knock-on effects also for developing countries. So it won't just be COVID that causes a hit to the textile industry in Bangladesh, for example. It will be the imposition of new tariffs and new restrictions. There again, information absolutely key, understanding the direct and indirect emissions of our consumption and taking action all along the supply chain to make sure that emissions are reduced. So, the answer to your question is yes, behavior change supported by the enabling environment, behavior change carried out in an informed and open way, and thinking globally and not just nationally about where emissions are going, with a strong and, I think, aid-led emphasis in developing countries on building the systems that will enable us to track global emissions across borders.
Thank you, Simon. Well put together. And that's all good advice for how we want to think about this part of the solution, which I think is going to become more and more important. And because we're going to run out of time, I just wanted to put the last question to you. As Simon pointed out, 2050 prospects and all the commitments might sound rosy, but in the meantime, we need to be thinking near-term policy action, as Katja pointed out, which can help us get there. What do you see as big challenges, and what's next for the GAP report to help us look at this part of the equation?
Thank you, Surabhi, and thank you, everyone. Well, to me, you can really summarize this in three main takeaways from this year's report. First of all, it's now 5 years since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, and we've seen no signs of a reduction in the emissions gap for 2030. So while we all agree that these net zero goals are fantastic and amazing and also can set the direction for the long term, we really need to see them backed up by short-term action, and we're not seeing that yet. And time is running out. If we don't reduce emissions significantly by 2030, basically the 1.5 degree limit will be out of reach. So there's no time to waste. And then I would say, of course, what's also really important is how we spend the money flowing into the COVID-19 recovery, as we also saw in the report. If we don't make the right choices, if we don't make the right decisions, it's going to be even more difficult for us to get on track to 2 and 1.5 degree by 2030. And just one example, I live in Denmark. I'm born here and live here, and the Danish government set forward a 70% reduction target by 2030 compared to 1919 last year. And there's been endless discussions and negotiations for a year now, and it's slowly moving. But just to illustrate that even in a country that has set a target 1 year ago, we're still not really getting anywhere. So it takes a heck of a long time just to get these things rolling, to get the policies in place, and then to implement them before we actually will reap the emission reduction benefits. Just to illustrate that there really is no time to waste. So what will the GAP report be doing? Because the GAP never sleeps. Next year, of course, we'll follow up on, do we see any signs of acceleration in actual policies and in implementation? Do we see any signs that these long-term targets are being translated into near-term action and stronger targets for 2030? And we plan to continuously keep track on the effects of the 2030 targets as they hopefully come in. Then we'll be looking into a more full analysis or assessment of the COVID-19 implications, and also on the fiscal spending, and whether that is hopefully going to be greener, turn greener next year. And then I would like to pose that question back to you, all of you here, at least on the panel. What would be really important for us to cover in the emissions gap report? And also to everybody who's participating, feel free to drop us an email if you have something that really needs to be covered, because we will be discussing this very shortly.
Great. Let's crowdsource some of the solutions that we can work towards, and hopefully every country doesn't take more than a year to figure out what policies to adopt. Thank you to all the panelists for excellent remarks and for actually summarizing your points very nicely. And I'm going to leave it to you to figure out what time there is for wrap up. Thank you.
We've received quite a few interesting questions, and we'll do our best to respond to them. I don't think we have enough time to go more into the questions now, but all of you who've asked questions, feel free to drop me or post them on the UNEP DTU website, and we'll make sure that they reach the right people. What I would just like to do is to thank you all, colleagues, friends, presenters, participants, for being with us today for these interesting discussions. The recording of the webinar will be made available, and please feel free to get in touch, to reach out and to make suggestions for what we should be covering in next year's report as well. So big thanks to everybody, and have a nice evening, morning, day, wherever you are.